The Mind Readers, Mastering Human Psychology for Ultimate Social Dominance. Let me tell you about the moment that transformed Victoria Chen from a talented executive who struggled with interpersonal influence to what behavioral scientists now call a mind reader, someone who has mastered human psychology so completely that they can read, predict, and influence others' thoughts, emotions, and behaviors with uncanny accuracy, achieving what appears to be supernatural social dominance. It was September 12, 2024, and Victoria was facing the most challenging negotiation of her career, convincing a hostile board to approve a $340 million initiative while knowing that 3 key members were secretly planning to vote against her. Most people navigate social situations through guesswork and intuition, often misreading others and failing to achieve their interpersonal objectives. Victoria discovered something that borders on mind control. She learned what Napoleon Hill called the psychological mastery method, the systematic approach to understanding and influencing human psychology with such precision that you can predict and guide others' mental processes, making resistance nearly impossible and cooperation inevitable. Within 15 months, Victoria had not only secured the board's unanimous approval, but had developed what colleagues called supernatural, interpersonal abilities, reading people's hidden motivations instantly, predicting their responses before they spoke, and influencing their decisions through psychological techniques that felt natural rather than manipulative. Tonight, you're going to learn the exact mind-reading framework Victoria used to master human psychology and achieve ultimate social dominance, and how you can apply these same principles to read, predict, and influence anyone in any situation, regardless of your current interpersonal skills or social experience. The social failure crisis. Victoria's awakening came during a critical board meeting where her inability to read the room and influence key stakeholders nearly destroyed her career. Despite having the best proposal and strongest data, she failed to secure support because she couldn't understand the hidden psychological dynamics, personal agendas, and emotional undercurrents that actually drove decision-making. "I was operating on the surface level while the real action was happening psychologically," Victoria later reflected. "I thought logic and facts would win, but I was completely blind to the fear, ego, politics, and personal motivations that actually controlled outcomes. I was playing checkers while everyone else was playing psychological chess." The crisis deepened when Victoria realized that her social blindness was limiting every aspect of her success. She couldn't build the alliances necessary for promotion, couldn't influence stakeholders to support her initiatives, and couldn't navigate the complex interpersonal dynamics that determined organizational success. That's when her executive coach, Dr. Michael Torres, introduced her to Professor Elena Zhang, a behavioral psychologist who had spent 25 years studying what she called applied psychology mastery, the ability to read and influence human behavior with scientific precision rather than social intuition, the mind-reading discovery. Professor Zhang had a revolutionary perspective on human psychology and social influence that completely changed Victoria's understanding of interpersonal effectiveness and social power. "Most people treat human behavior as mysterious and unpredictable," Professor Zhang explained. "They try to influence others through persuasion techniques rather than psychological understanding. Mind readers operate from deep knowledge of how human psychology actually works, the predictable patterns, hidden motivations, and unconscious drives that control behavior." Professor Zhang showed Victoria research demonstrating that human behavior follows systematic psychological patterns that can be read and influenced with remarkable accuracy. Every person's decisions, reactions, and responses are driven by identifiable psychological factors that can be analyzed, predicted, and strategically influenced. "Social dominance isn't about charisma or manipulation," Professor Zhang continued. "It's about understanding psychology so deeply that you can read what others are thinking, predict how they'll respond, and guide their mental processes toward outcomes that serve everyone's interests. When you master psychological reading, influence becomes effortless." The 5 mind-reading principles. Over the next 6 months, Professor Zhang taught Victoria 5 fundamental principles that transform ordinary social interaction into psychological mastery. Principle 1, psychological pattern recognition. Instead of taking behavior at face value, mind readers identify the underlying psychological patterns, motivations, and drives that create observable behavior, allowing them to understand the real causes behind actions and responses. Principle 2, micro-expression and nonverbal analysis. Rather than relying only on verbal communication, mind readers systematically read facial expressions, body language, vocal patterns, and other nonverbal signals that reveal true thoughts and emotions regardless of what people say. Principle 3, motivational mapping and drive analysis. Mind readers understand the hierarchy of human motivations and can identify which psychological drives are most influential for specific individuals, allowing them to craft approaches that align with each person's deepest motivational patterns. Principle 4, cognitive bias utilization and mental shortcut mastery. Instead of fighting against human psychology, mind readers leverage predictable cognitive biases and mental shortcuts to guide thinking and decision-making in directions that achieve desired outcomes naturally. Principle 5, influence architecture and response engineering. Mind readers design interactions that create specific psychological states and responses in others, engineering conversations and situations that naturally lead to cooperation, agreement, and desired behavioral outcomes. Victoria's 15-month mind reading transformation. Under Professor Zhang's guidance, Victoria systematically developed her psychological mastery capabilities. Month 1-3, Human Psychology Foundation and Pattern Recognition Training. Victoria began by studying fundamental human psychology, understanding how the brain processes information, makes decisions, and responds to different stimuli. She learned to recognize the basic psychological patterns that drive all human behavior: the need for status, security, connection, autonomy, and meaning. Working with Professor Zhang, Victoria practiced identifying these patterns in colleagues, clients, and board members. She learned to look beyond surface behaviors to understand the underlying psychological needs and fears that motivated actions and resistance. "I started seeing people as psychological systems rather than mysterious personalities," Victoria explained. "Everyone's behavior made sense once I understood their underlying motivational patterns and psychological needs. Reading people became like reading a language I suddenly understood." Month 4-6, micro-expression mastery and nonverbal communication analysis. Victoria learned advanced techniques for reading facial expressions, body language, vocal patterns, and other nonverbal communication that revealed true thoughts and emotions. She discovered that people constantly broadcast their internal states through micro-expressions and physical signals that most people miss entirely. She practiced what Professor Zhang called psychological surveillance, systematically observing and interpreting the subtle signals that indicated agreement, resistance, confusion, excitement, fear, and other internal states. This allowed her to adjust her approach in real time based on others' actual responses rather than assumed reactions. Victoria also learned to control her own nonverbal communication to create specific psychological impressions and emotional states in others. She developed presence and communication patterns that naturally induced trust, confidence, and cooperation. Month 7-9, individual psychology profiling and motivational assessment. Victoria developed expertise in quickly assessing individuals' psychological profiles and primary motivational drivers. She learned to identify whether someone was primarily motivated by achievement, power, affiliation, security, or autonomy, allowing her to tailor her approach to each person's specific psychological makeup. She created systematic approaches for gathering psychological intelligence about important stakeholders before key interactions. Through observation, conversation, and research, she could map people's motivational patterns, communication preferences, decision-making styles, and influence triggers. Victoria also learned to identify psychological resistance patterns and the specific fears or concerns that created opposition to her initiatives. This allowed her to address underlying psychological barriers rather than just surface objections. Month 10-12, cognitive bias mastery and influence psychology. Victoria mastered the systematic use of cognitive biases and mental shortcuts to guide thinking and decision-making. She learned how anchoring, reciprocity, social proof, authority, scarcity, and other psychological principles could be ethically applied to create natural influence and cooperation. She developed what Professor Zhang called influence architecture, systematic approaches for structuring interactions that created specific psychological states and responses. Instead of trying to convince people through argument, she learned to create psychological conditions where desired conclusions felt obvious and inevitable. Victoria also learned advanced persuasion techniques, including strategic questioning, assumption management, alternative framing, and consensus building that guided groups toward unanimous decisions while making everyone feel heard and valued. Month 13-15, Advanced Social Psychology and Group Dynamics Mastery, Victoria developed expertise in reading and influencing group psychology and social dynamics. She learned to identify opinion leaders, coalition patterns, social hierarchies, and collective emotional states that determined group behavior and decision-making. She mastered techniques for managing group psychology during meetings, presentations, and negotiations. Victoria could sense when groups were moving toward consensus or resistance and knew how to influence collective psychology to achieve desired outcomes. Victoria also learned to use social psychology principles like conformity, social proof, and group identity to create psychological momentum for her initiatives. She became skilled at identifying and leveraging the social forces that naturally encouraged cooperation and agreement. The extraordinary mind reading results. By month 15, Victoria's psychological mastery had produced remarkable outcomes. Board influence success achieved unanimous approval for the $340 million initiative by reading board psychology and crafting approaches that addressed each member's specific motivational patterns and concerns. Career advancement. Promoted to Chief Strategy Officer within 12 months due to unprecedented ability to build stakeholder support and navigate complex organizational politics through psychological understanding. Negotiation mastery. Achieved 95% success rate in high-stakes negotiations by reading psychological patterns and crafting win-win solutions that addressed hidden motivational needs rather than stated positions. Team leadership excellence. Transformed team performance by understanding individual psychology and creating motivational approaches tailored to each person's specific psychological drivers and communication preferences. Relationship building. Developed extensive network of influential allies by understanding and serving others' psychological needs while advancing her own objectives through mutually beneficial relationships. Conflict resolution. Became go-to executive for resolving interpersonal conflicts by reading underlying psychological dynamics and creating solutions that addressed root psychological causes rather than surface symptoms. The mind reading framework. Through Victoria's transformation and Professor Zhang's research with hundreds of professionals, they developed a comprehensive framework for psychological mastery. Phase 1. Psychology Foundation and Human Behavior Understanding Study. Fundamental human psychology, including motivation theory, cognitive biases, and decision-making processes. Learn to recognize basic psychological patterns that drive all human behavior, understand how emotions, fears, and needs influence thoughts and actions, develop systematic approaches for observing and analyzing human behavior patterns. Phase 2. Nonverbal communication and micro-expression analysis. Master reading facial expressions, body language, vocal patterns, and other nonverbal signals. Develop ability to detect true emotions and thoughts, regardless of verbal communication. Learn to control own nonverbal communication to create desired psychological impressions. Practice real-time adjustment based on others' psychological responses and feedback. Phase 3. Individual assessment and psychological profiling. Learn to quickly assess individuals' motivational patterns and psychological drivers. Develop systematic approaches for gathering psychological intelligence about important stakeholders. Identify resistance patterns and underlying concerns that create opposition. Create tailored influence approaches based on individual psychological profiles and preferences. Phase 4. Influence psychology and cognitive bias application. Master ethical application of cognitive biases and mental shortcuts for natural influence. Develop influence architecture that creates desired psychological states and responses. Learn advanced persuasion techniques, including strategic questioning and consensus building. Practice creating psychological conditions where cooperation feels obvious and inevitable. Phase 5. Group psychology and social dynamics mastery. Understand group psychology, including opinion leadership, coalition patterns, and collective decision-making. Master techniques for reading and influencing group emotional states and social dynamics. Learn to leverage social psychology principles for creating psychological momentum. Develop expertise in managing complex stakeholder relationships and organizational politics. Real-world mind-reading applications. Case Study 1. The merger psychology master investment banker Sarah Kim used psychological mastery to facilitate a $2.8 billion merger between traditionally competing companies. By reading the psychological patterns of key executives and understanding their hidden concerns about status, control, and legacy, she crafted a merger structure that addressed psychological needs rather than just financial terms. Her psychological approach achieved unanimous approval where previous attempts had failed. Case Study 2. The sales psychology genius technology sales director Michael Torres increased his closing rate from 35% to 89% by mastering customer psychology and decision-making patterns. Instead of traditional sales techniques, he learned to read buying psychology, identify decision-making criteria, and address underlying psychological barriers to purchase. His psychological approach made sales conversations feel consultative rather than persuasive. Case study 3. The political psychology strategist campaign manager Lisa Wong achieved upset electoral victory by mastering voter psychology and message resonance patterns. Through systematic psychological analysis of voter motivations, fears, and decision-making triggers, she crafted messaging that created emotional connection and psychological alignment rather than logical argument. Her psychological campaign strategy overcame significant resource disadvantages. The neuroscience of psychological reading and influence. Modern neuroscience provides frameworks for understanding how psychological reading and influence work at the brain level. Mirror neuron systems and emotional contagion research demonstrates that mirror neurons automatically synchronize emotional states between people, allowing skilled individuals to read and influence others' psychological states through emotional resonance. Cognitive load theory and decision-making shortcut studies show that people rely on mental shortcuts when cognitive load is high, making them predictably susceptible to influence through systematic bias utilization and cognitive architecture. Social brain networks and group psychology neuroscience research reveals that humans have specialized brain networks for social cognition that can be read and influenced through understanding of social psychology principles. Unconscious processing and implicit influence brain imaging shows that much of human decision-making occurs unconsciously, allowing for influence through subliminal psychological techniques that operate below conscious awareness. Advanced mind reading techniques. Advanced psychological profiling and personality assessment develop expertise in sophisticated personality assessment tools and psychological profiling techniques that reveal deep motivational patterns and predict behavioral responses accurately. Micro-expression analysis and facial coding mastery master advanced facial expression analysis, including the 7 universal micro-expressions and cultural variations that reveal true emotional states regardless of conscious expression control. Conversational psychology and strategic dialogue. Learn advanced conversation techniques that extract psychological information while building rapport and trust, creating natural information flow that reveals motivational patterns and influence opportunities. Group psychology orchestration and social dynamic management develop ability to read and influence complex group psychology, including coalition building, consensus creation, and collective decision-making through understanding of social influence principles. The technology tools for psychological mastery. Psychological assessment and profiling software use advanced personality assessment tools and psychological profiling platforms that provide systematic analysis of motivational patterns and behavioral predictions for key stakeholders. Video analysis and micro-expression detection tools leverage technology that analyzes facial expressions, body language, and vocal patterns to provide objective feedback on psychological reading accuracy and nonverbal communication effectiveness. Social network analysis and relationship mapping platforms implement tools that map social relationships, influence networks, and communication patterns to understand group psychology and identify key influence points in organizations. Conversation analysis and dialogue optimization software use platforms that analyze communication patterns and provide feedback on influence effectiveness, helping optimize psychological impact and persuasion capabilities. The daily mind reading practice. Successful mind readers develop consistent psychological development routines. Morning psychology preparation, 15 minutes. Review psychological profiles and motivational patterns of people you'll interact with during the day. Plan influence approaches based on individual psychology and desired outcomes. Practice micro-expression recognition and nonverbal communication control. Midday psychological observation and analysis, 10 minutes. Practice reading psychological patterns and motivational drivers of people you encounter. Analyze successful and unsuccessful influence attempts to identify improvement opportunities. Adjust approach based on real-time psychological feedback and responses. Evening psychology review and development, 15 minutes. Review day's psychological observations and influence outcomes to identify successful patterns, analyze psychological reading accuracy, and areas for improvement. Plan psychological development activities and practice opportunities for tomorrow. Common mind reading mistakes. Mistake 1. Assuming everyone shares your psychological patterns, projecting your own motivational patterns onto others, rather than accurately reading their unique psychological makeup and motivational drivers. Mistake 2. Relying on stereotypes rather than individual assessment, using general psychological categories rather than conducting specific psychological analysis of individual patterns and motivational structures. Mistake 3. Focusing on manipulation rather than mutual benefit, using psychological knowledge for personal advantage rather than creating win-win outcomes that serve everyone's psychological needs and interests. Mistake 4. Ignoring ethical boundaries and consent, applying psychological influence without considering ethical implications or respecting others' autonomy and decision-making freedom. Mistake 5. Over-relying on techniques rather than genuine understanding, using psychological techniques mechanically rather than developing deep understanding and authentic connection with others' psychological experiences. Building your mind reading system. Weeks 1-4, Psychology Foundation and Basic Pattern Recognition Study, Fundamental Human Psychology, including motivation theory and decision-making processes. Practice basic psychological observation and pattern recognition with colleagues and friends. Begin developing awareness of own psychological patterns and biases. Start reading nonverbal communication and micro-expressions systematically. Weeks 5-12, Individual Assessment and Psychological Profiling Development. Learn systematic approaches for assessing individual psychological patterns and motivational drivers. Practice gathering psychological intelligence through observation and conversation. Develop ability to tailor communication and influence approaches based on individual psychology. Experiment with basic influence techniques and cognitive bias applications. Weeks 13-26, Advanced Influence Psychology and Communication Mastery. Master ethical application of cognitive biases and influence principles for natural cooperation. Develop advanced conversation and questioning techniques that reveal psychological patterns. Practice creating influence architecture that guides thinking toward desired conclusions. Learn to manage resistance and address psychological barriers effectively. Weeks 27-39, Group Psychology and Social Dynamics Integration. Understand group psychology, including social influence and collective decision-making patterns. Master techniques for reading and influencing group dynamics and stakeholder relationships. Develop expertise in managing complex psychological situations and organizational politics. Practice advanced conflict resolution and consensus building through psychological understanding. Weeks 40-52, Mastery Integration and Ethical Application. Achieve reliable psychological reading and influence capabilities across diverse situations and relationships. Develop advanced techniques for complex psychological challenges and high-stakes influence situations. Integrate mind reading into all aspects of professional and personal effectiveness. Establish reputation for exceptional interpersonal effectiveness and social leadership. Your social dominance revolution. Victoria Chen's transformation from social blindness to psychological mastery wasn't about learning manipulation techniques. It was about understanding human psychology so deeply that influence becomes natural and ethical. She discovered that social dominance comes from serving others' psychological needs while achieving your own objectives. The mind-reading method she mastered isn't about controlling others. It's about understanding psychology so completely that you can create win-win outcomes that feel obvious and inevitable to everyone involved. Psychological mastery represents the ultimate social advantage. When you can read, predict, and influence human behavior through deep psychological understanding, you transcend the limitations that keep most people ineffective in interpersonal situations and create possibilities for social success that appear supernatural. Your ability to achieve your objectives through others ultimately depends on your psychological understanding rather than your persuasion techniques or social charisma. Those who understand human psychology will always outperform those who rely on intuition and social guesswork. The framework exists, the psychology is documented, the techniques are learnable. The only variable is your commitment to understanding human psychology rather than trying to manipulate human behavior. Like this video if you're ready to master mind reading and achieve ultimate social dominance through psychological understanding. Subscribe to this channel for continued psychological mastery and influence development education. Comment below with your biggest interpersonal challenge. Let's analyze the psychology together. Remember, social dominance isn't about controlling others, it's about understanding psychology so deeply that cooperation becomes inevitable. Start your mind-reading mastery today.